Margaret Williams had always been different from other children in her small village outside London. While other kids played with dolls and toy cars, she spent hours drawing pictures of grand buildings and reading every history book she could find about British royalty. Her fascination wasn't with the glamour or jewels, but with the stories of real people who lived behind those massive stone walls. At 25, Margaret worked as a junior archivist at the British Museum. Her days were spent cataloging old documents and artifacts, but her heart yearned for something more meaningful. She had studied history at university, specializing in medieval British architecture, and dreamed of one day working directly with historical preservation projects. The opportunity came unexpectedly on a rainy Tuesday morning in March. Her supervisor, Dr. Harrison, called her into his cluttered office filled with ancient maps and fading photographs. He looked tired, his gray hair more disheveled than usual, and there were dark circles under his eyes. "Margaret, I need someone I can trust for a very special assignment," he began, adjusting his thick glasses. "The palace has requested our assistance with a delicate situation. They've discovered some structural damage in one of the older wings, and they need an expert to assess potential historical artifacts that might be affected during repair work." Margaret's heart raced. The palace meant Buckingham Palace, the very symbol of British monarchy she had studied and admired from afar for so many years. She tried to keep her voice steady as she responded, "I would be honored to help with such an important project. Dr. Harrison, there's something you should know," he continued, his expression growing more serious. "This particular wing has been closed to the public for decades. It contains some of the oldest parts of the original structure, dating back centuries. The palace is very concerned about maintaining absolute discretion regarding what you might find there." 2 days later, Margaret stood at the staff entrance of Buckingham Palace, her leather satchel containing notebooks, measuring tools, and a camera hanging from her shoulder. The morning fog created an almost mystical atmosphere around the massive building. She had barely slept the night before, her mind racing with excitement and nervousness about what lay ahead. A stern-looking man in his 50s, wearing the distinctive red and gold uniform of a palace guard, approached her. His name tag read Captain Morrison, and his weathered face suggested years of dedicated service. His dark eyes studied her carefully as he checked her identification against his clipboard. "Miss Williams, I am Captain Morrison. I'll be your escort during your time here," he said in a clipped, professional tone. "I must stress the importance of following protocol exactly. You are not to photograph, document, or discuss anything beyond your specific assignment without explicit permission." Margaret nodded eagerly, understanding the gravity of her position. As they walked through seemingly endless corridors lined with portraits of long-dead monarchs and decorated with priceless artwork, Captain Morrison explained the layout of the area she would be working in. "The Grosvenor Wing," he said as they approached a heavy wooden door secured with multiple locks, "has been sealed since 1987 due to structural concerns. Recent inspections have revealed water damage that threatens both the building's integrity and potentially valuable historical items stored there." The heavy door creaked open, releasing air that smelled of old wood, dust, and something else Margaret couldn't quite identify. As they stepped inside, her breath caught in her throat. The space was far larger than she had expected, with soaring ceilings and tall windows that had been boarded up decades ago. Weak light filtered through gaps in the boards, creating dramatic shadows across the room. Along the walls stood dozens of covered furniture pieces, their white sheets looking like ghosts in the dim light. Wooden crates of various sizes were stacked carefully throughout the space, each bearing faded labels with dates ranging from the early 1800s to the mid-1900s. The water damage was evident in several areas, where dark stains spread across the ornate wallpaper and ceiling. "Your job," Captain Morrison explained, "is to catalog everything here and assess what needs immediate attention to prevent further deterioration. The repair work cannot begin until we know exactly what we're dealing with." Margaret began her work methodically, starting with the items closest to the water damage. As she carefully lifted sheets from furniture pieces, she discovered treasures that took her breath away. An ornate writing desk that appeared to be from the Georgian era sat next to a collection of ceremonial swords in glass cases. Each item told a story of the people who had once used them, lived with them, and valued them enough to preserve them. By the third day, Margaret had settled into a routine. Captain Morrison would unlock the wing each morning at precisely 8 o'clock, escort her inside, and returned to collect her at 5 in the evening. He rarely spoke beyond necessary instructions, but she noticed he often lingered near the doorway, watching her work with an expression she couldn't quite read. It was during her examination of a particularly intriguing collection of personal letters tied with faded ribbon that Margaret made her first significant discovery. The letters were addressed to "My dearest Edward" and signed, "Your devoted Victoria." The handwriting was elegant but hurried, and the dates on the letters spanned several years in the 1840s. Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she realized she might be holding previously unknown correspondence between Queen Victoria and Prince Albert before their marriage. The historical significance was enormous, but she knew she needed to be absolutely certain before reporting her findings. As she carefully photographed each letter for her documentation, she became aware that Captain Morrison had been standing in the doorway longer than usual. When she looked up, she noticed his expression had changed. The stern professionalism was still there, but there was something else now. Concern, perhaps, or worry. "Miss Williams," he said quietly, "I must remind you that discretion is paramount in this assignment." Margaret assured him that she understood completely, but his warning lingered in her mind as she continued her work. She sensed there was more to this assignment than simple historical preservation, and Captain Morrison knew something he wasn't sharing with her. Margaret's discovery of the Victoria and Albert letters was just the beginning. Over the following week, she uncovered a treasure trove of historical artifacts that seemed to tell a story the official history books had never revealed. Hidden beneath layers of protective cloth in an ornate cedar chest, she found a collection of children's drawings, signed with names she recognized from her studies of the royal family tree. The drawings were clearly created by royal children from different eras, some dating back to the early 1900s. What struck Margaret as unusual was that many of these drawings depicted scenes that seemed too mature for children to have witnessed or understood. There were sketches of formal meetings, what appeared to be secret gatherings, and even some that showed people in obvious distress. Captain Morrison's behavior had become increasingly strange as well. He now arrived earlier each morning and seemed reluctant to leave her alone in the wing. She often caught him studying her documentation over her shoulder, and his questions about her findings had become more frequent and pointed. "Miss Williams," he said one afternoon as she was carefully examining a collection of official documents, "how much longer do you estimate this assessment will take?" Margaret looked up from a particularly interesting letter bearing multiple royal seals. "I'm making good progress, Captain Morrison, but there's so much here. Some of these items appear to be quite significant historically. I want to ensure I don't miss anything important." His jaw tightened slightly. "The repair work needs to begin soon. Water damage doesn't wait for historical curiosity." There was something in his tone that made Margaret pause. Throughout her time at the palace, she had come to respect Captain Morrison's dedication to his duty, but now she sensed he was under pressure from someone higher up. The way he emphasized historical curiosity suggested he viewed her thoroughness as unnecessary delay rather than professional diligence. That evening, as Margaret reviewed her notes in her small London flat, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was missing something important. The artifacts she had found were certainly valuable from a historical perspective, but they seemed to form a pattern that she couldn't quite grasp. The letters, documents, and personal items all seemed connected by themes of secrecy, hidden meetings, and communications that were clearly meant to remain private. The next morning brought an unexpected development. When Captain Morrison arrived to escort her to the wing, he was accompanied by a woman Margaret had never seen before. She was impeccably dressed in a tailored black suit, with silver hair pulled back in a severe bun and sharp blue eyes that seemed to take in every detail. "Miss Williams," Captain Morrison said formally, "this is Mrs. Blackwood from the Palace Administration. She wanted to review your progress personally." Mrs. Blackwood extended a perfectly manicured hand, but her smile didn't reach her eyes. "Miss Williams, we're very impressed with the thoroughness of your work. Captain Morrison has been keeping us informed of your discoveries." Margaret shook the offered hand, noting how cold it felt despite the warm spring day. "Thank you, Mrs. Blackwood. I've been honored to work with such remarkable historical artifacts." "Yes, about that," Mrs. Blackwood continued, her tone becoming more businesslike. "We've decided to expedite the repair process. We'll need you to focus only on items that are in immediate danger from water damage. Everything else can be dealt with later." Margaret felt her heart sink. She had been hoping for more time to properly document and research the items she had found, particularly the letters and documents that seemed to reveal previously unknown aspects of royal history. "I understand the urgency of protecting items from water damage," she said carefully, "but some of the things I've found appear to have significant historical value that should be properly documented before any repair work begins." Mrs. Blackwood's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. "Miss Williams, I'm sure you understand that the palace has its own protocols for handling historical materials. Your job is to identify items at immediate risk, not to conduct historical research." As they entered the Grosvenor wing, Margaret noticed that several of the crates she had been planning to examine that day had been moved. When she mentioned this to Captain Morrison, he simply said that maintenance staff had needed to access the area behind them to assess the structural damage. But Margaret wasn't convinced. The crates had been moved too carefully, too systematically, and she was certain that some of the smaller boxes were missing entirely. When she checked her notes against what remained, she confirmed that at least 3 boxes of documents had been removed overnight. "Captain Morrison," she said quietly when Mrs. Blackwood was examining water damage on the far side of the room, "some of the materials I catalogued yesterday seem to be missing." His face remained impassive, but she noticed a slight tightening around his eyes. "Everything is being handled according to protocol, Miss Williams. Please focus on your assigned tasks." Margaret spent the day feeling increasingly frustrated and suspicious. Every time she tried to examine items that seemed historically significant, either Captain Morrison or Mrs. Blackwood would redirect her attention to obviously less important pieces. It became clear that they wanted her to complete her assessment quickly and with minimal documentation of anything truly valuable. During her lunch break, Margaret made a decision that would change everything. Using her phone's camera, she quickly photographed several of the most significant letters and documents she had found, including the Victoria and Albert correspondence and some official papers that appeared to contain information about secret diplomatic meetings. She knew she was violating the strict protocols she had agreed to, but her historian's instincts told her that something important was being hidden. These documents deserved proper scholarly attention, not to be buried again in storage or possibly destroyed to protect someone's reputation. When she returned from lunch, Mrs. Blackwood was waiting for her with a new stack of forms. "Miss Williams, we need you to sign additional confidentiality agreements. Some of the materials you've encountered are more sensitive than initially anticipated." Margaret read through the documents carefully. The language was much more restrictive than her original agreement, essentially prohibiting her from ever discussing or publishing anything about what she had found, regardless of its historical significance. The penalties for violation were severe, including substantial financial damages and potential criminal prosecution. "This seems quite extreme," Margaret said, looking up at Mrs. Blackwood. "I understood that my role was to help preserve historical artifacts, not to sign away academic freedom." Mrs. Blackwood's smile was cold. "Miss Williams, you've been entrusted with access to materials that could affect the reputation and privacy of the royal family. Surely you understand that such responsibility comes with obligations." As Margaret hesitated, Captain Morrison stepped forward. For the first time since she had met him, his professional facade cracked slightly. "Miss Williams," he said quietly, "please consider carefully. Some things are better left undisturbed." There was something in his voice, almost a warning, that made Margaret look at him more closely. Behind his stern expression, she saw something that looked almost like regret, or perhaps fear. She realized that Captain Morrison wasn't just following orders. He was caught in the middle of something much larger than a simple historical preservation project. Margaret made her choice. "I need some time to review these documents before signing them," she said, hoping her voice sounded steadier than she felt. Mrs. Blackwood's eyes narrowed. "I'm afraid that's not possible. The agreements need to be signed today, or we'll have to terminate your involvement in this project immediately." The ultimatum hung in the air like a challenge. Margaret looked around the room at the covered furniture and remaining crates, knowing that walking away now meant abandoning potentially crucial historical discoveries. But signing those papers would mean silencing herself forever about whatever secrets lay hidden in the Grosvenor wing. Margaret stood in the dusty silence of the Grosvenor wing, the restrictive confidentiality agreement still unsigned in her hands. Mrs. Blackwood's cold stare bore into her while Captain Morrison shifted uncomfortably behind them. The weight of the decision pressed down on her shoulders like the centuries of history contained within these walls. "I need to make a phone call," Margaret said finally, her voice firm despite the tremor in her hands. "To my supervisor at the British Museum. He needs to know about any changes to my assignment parameters." Mrs. Blackwood's jaw tightened. "That won't be necessary, Miss Williams." The museum was informed that additional security measures might be required. "Then Dr. Harrison will understand why I need to consult with him before signing this," Margaret replied, grateful that her years of academic training had taught her to question authority when necessary. The tension in the room was palpable. Captain Morrison cleared his throat softly, and when Margaret looked at him, she caught something in his expression she hadn't seen before, a barely perceptible nod, as if he was encouraging her to stand her ground. Mrs. Blackwood glanced at her watch with obvious irritation. "Very well. You have until tomorrow morning to make your decision. Captain Morrison will escort you out." As they walked through the long corridors back to the staff entrance, Captain Morrison remained unusually quiet. It wasn't until they reached the final security checkpoint that he spoke, and when he did, his words were carefully measured. "Miss Williams, I've served the Crown for 28 years. In that time, I've learned that sometimes the most loyal thing you can do is ask the difficult questions." He paused, looking around to ensure they weren't overheard. "History has a way of surfacing eventually, regardless of how many papers people sign." Margaret studied his weathered face, seeing decades of dedication etched in every line. "Captain Morrison, what aren't they telling me about what's in that wing?" He was quiet for so long that Margaret thought he wouldn't answer. Finally, he spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "Some stories are buried for good reasons, Miss Williams, but some are buried for the wrong reasons. The trick is knowing the difference." That evening, Margaret spread her secretly photographed documents across her kitchen table, her laptop open beside her as she began researching the names, dates, and references she had discovered. What she found made her hands shake as she typed. The letters between Victoria and Albert weren't just romantic correspondence. They contained discussions of political decisions that had never been made public, references to meetings with foreign dignitaries that didn't appear in any official records. Most troubling were hints about a diplomatic agreement regarding Ireland that seemed to contradict the official historical narrative she had studied in university. But it was a series of documents from the early 1900s that truly shocked her. Official papers bearing King Edward VII's seal discussed secret negotiations with German representatives years before World War I. The implications were staggering. If authentic, these documents suggested that the British royal family had been involved in diplomatic efforts that could have prevented or altered the course of the war. Margaret's phone rang, startling her from her research. Dr. Harrison's voice sounded strained when she answered. "Margaret, I've just had a very interesting conversation with someone from the palace administration. They seem to think you've been overstepping your assignment boundaries. Dr. Harrison, I've found documents that could significantly change our understanding of British royal history. These aren't just artifacts, they're evidence of diplomatic activities that were never made public." There was a long pause before Dr. Harrison responded. "Margaret, I need you to be very careful here. The British Museum has relationships with the Crown that go back generations. We can't afford to jeopardize those relationships over historical speculation." "This isn't speculation, Dr. Harrison. I have photographs of official documents with royal seals. This is primary source material that historians have never had access to." Another pause, longer this time. "Photographs? Margaret, you were specifically instructed not to document anything beyond your assessment parameters." Margaret realized with a sinking heart that even Dr. Harrison, whom she had trusted and respected for years, was more concerned with institutional politics than historical truth. "What would you have me do? Pretend I never saw evidence that could rewrite our understanding of British diplomatic history? I would have you complete your assignment as agreed and turn over any unauthorized materials to the proper authorities," Dr. Harrison said firmly. "Margaret, I'm speaking as your supervisor and as someone who cares about your career. Don't make this more complicated than it needs to be." After ending the call, Margaret sat staring at the documents spread before her. Every instinct she had as a historian told her that these materials were too important to be buried again. But everyone in authority, from Mrs. Blackwood to Dr. Harrison, was telling her to walk away. The next morning, Margaret arrived at the palace staff entrance with her unsigned confidentiality agreement and a heavy heart. Captain Morrison was waiting for her, but his usual crisp professionalism seemed forced, and there were dark circles under his eyes suggesting he hadn't slept well either. "Good morning, Miss Williams," he said formally, but she caught the concern in his voice. "Mrs. Blackwood is waiting for you in the administrative office before we proceed to the wing." The administrative office was a stark contrast to the ornate historical rooms Margaret had grown accustomed to. Modern furniture, fluorescent lighting, and the smell of fresh coffee created an atmosphere that felt removed from the centuries of history surrounding them. Mrs. Blackwood sat behind a polished desk, the unsigned agreement prominently displayed in front of her. "Miss Williams, I trust you've had time to consider your position," Mrs. Blackwood said without preamble. Margaret took a deep breath, knowing that her next words would determine not only her future, but possibly the fate of historically significant documents. "I have considered it very carefully, Mrs. Blackwood. As a professional historian, I cannot in good conscience sign an agreement that would prevent me from ever discussing or researching materials of significant historical value." Mrs. Blackwood's expression hardened. "Then I'm afraid your services are no longer required. You'll need to turn over all notes, photographs, and materials related to your work here immediately." "I understand," Margaret replied, reaching into her satchel to retrieve her official notebooks and assessment forms, but she didn't mention the photographs stored on her personal phone. Captain Morrison stepped forward. "Mrs. Blackwood, perhaps we could find a compromise. Miss Williams has been very professional in her work and her assessment isn't quite complete." "Captain Morrison," Mrs. Blackwood said sharply, "your opinion on this matter is not required. Please escort Miss Williams to collect any personal items from the wing. Then see her off the premises." As they walked toward the Grosvenor wing for what Margaret knew would be the last time, Captain Morrison seemed to be struggling with some internal conflict. His steps were slower than usual, and he kept glancing at Margaret as if he wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. When they reached the heavy wooden door, Captain Morrison paused with his hand on the lock. "Miss Williams, I need you to know that not everyone believes this is the right course of action." Margaret looked at him carefully. "Captain Morrison, you've dedicated your life to serving the Crown. Why are you having doubts about this?" He turned the key in the lock but didn't immediately open the door. "Because sometimes serving the Crown means serving the truth, not just protecting secrets. And sometimes," he said, his voice dropping even lower, "protecting secrets can cause more harm than revealing them." As they entered the wing, Margaret was shocked to see that most of the remaining crates and furniture had been covered with heavy plastic tarps. Workers in maintenance uniforms were moving systematically through the room, clearly preparing to relocate everything she had spent weeks cataloging. "Where are they taking everything?" she asked Captain Morrison. His face was grim as he watched the workers. "Somewhere safe, I'm told. Somewhere they won't be disturbed again." Margaret felt a surge of desperation as she watched centuries of hidden history being packed away once more. These documents and artifacts represented voices from the past that deserved to be heard. Stories that could provide valuable insights into British diplomatic history and royal decision-making during crucial periods. "Captain Morrison," she said urgently, "what if those documents could prevent future conflicts by showing how past diplomatic efforts succeeded or failed? What if they contain lessons that could save lives?" He stopped walking and turned to face her fully. For a moment, the professional mask slipped completely, and Margaret saw the internal struggle written plainly across his weathered features. Captain Morrison stood frozen in the doorway of the Grosvenor wing, his hand still gripping the doorframe as he watched the systematic removal of centuries of hidden history. Margaret could see the war playing out in his expression, duty against conscience. "Loyalty against truth, Miss Williams," he said finally, his voice hoarse with emotion. "I need to tell you something, but not here. Too many ears." Margaret's heart raced as she followed him deeper into the wing, past the workers who were too focused on their careful packing to pay attention to their conversation. Captain Morrison led her to a small alcove behind a massive bookshelf, where tall windows had once overlooked the palace gardens before being boarded up decades ago. 28 years ago, when I first started working here," he began, his voice barely audible, "there was another incident, a fire in the East Wing that destroyed what officials claimed were unimportant storage materials. I was young then, Just a junior guard, but I saw what was really burned. Margaret leaned closer, sensing that Captain Morrison was about to share something that had haunted him for decades. Documents, he continued, his weathered hands clasping and unclasping as he spoke. Hundreds of documents about the royal family's knowledge of the concentration camps years before the war ended. Evidence that British intelligence had detailed reports about what was happening, but political considerations prevented action. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. If what Captain Morrison was telling her was true, it meant that crucial historical evidence had been deliberately destroyed to protect the monarchy's reputation. "Why are you telling me this?" she whispered. Captain Morrison's eyes met hers, and she saw decades of suppressed guilt and regret. "Because I've spent 28 years wondering how many lives might have been saved if those documents had been made public. If diplomatic pressure had been applied sooner. If the truth hadn't been buried for the sake of royal image." A sound from the main room made them both freeze. Mrs. Blackwood's sharp voice directing the workers to be more careful with a particular crate. Captain Morrison quickly stepped away from Margaret, his professional demeanor snapping back into place, but not before he pressed something small and cold into her hand. Margaret looked down to see an old brass key, tarnished with age but obviously well-maintained. She looked up at Captain Morrison questioningly, but he had already turned away, his attention focused on the workers. "Captain Morrison," Mrs. Blackwood called out, "please escort Miss Williams to collect her belongings so she can be on her way." Margaret slipped the key into her pocket, her mind racing with questions. As she gathered her few personal items from the work table she had used for weeks, she tried to catch Captain Morrison's eye, but he remained professionally distant, though she noticed his jaw was clenched tighter than usual. The walk back through the palace corridors felt like a funeral march. With each step, Margaret felt the weight of lost opportunities and buried truths. The photographs on her phone seemed insignificant compared to what Captain Morrison had just revealed about the systematic destruction of historical evidence. At the staff entrance, Mrs. Blackwood appeared with a final set of papers for Margaret to sign. Acknowledgement that she had returned all official materials and confirmation that she understood her ongoing obligations regarding confidentiality. "Trust this concludes our business. Miss Williams," Mrs. Blackwood said with a cold smile, "I hope you understand that any attempt to discuss or publicize your experience here would be most unwise." Margaret signed the papers mechanically, her mind still reeling from Captain Morrison's revelation. As she prepared to leave, she turned back to him one final time. "Captain Morrison, thank you for your professionalism throughout this assignment," she said formally, but her eyes conveyed a deeper message of gratitude and understanding. He nodded stiffly, but she caught the slight softening around his eyes. "Miss Williams, I hope your future endeavors in historical research prove more straightforward." That evening, Margaret sat in her flat surrounded by the photographs she had taken, but they seemed almost meaningless now. Captain Morrison's story about the destroyed documents had shaken her to her core. She began researching the fire he had mentioned, using newspaper archives and official records. What she found was troubling. The 1997 fire in the East Wing had been reported as a minor incident involving stored paperwork and old furniture. The official investigation concluded that faulty electrical wiring was to blame, and insurance records showed that the damaged materials were deemed of no historical significance. But Margaret's historian instincts told her there was more to the story. She cross-referenced the timing of the fire with major historical events and royal activities from that period. The fire had occurred just 3 months before the release of several major historical studies about British wartime diplomacy, studies that had noted significant gaps in available documentation. Margaret pulled out the brass key Captain Morrison had given her, turning it over in her hands as she considered its possible significance. It was clearly old, possibly dating to the early 20th century based on its design and craftsmanship. But what did he expect her to do with it? Her laptop chimed with an email notification. The sender was anonymous, but the subject line made her heart race. For the historian who asks difficult questions. With trembling fingers, Margaret opened the email. It contained a single address, a location in central London she didn't recognize, and a time. "Tomorrow, 3 p.m., bring the key. Come alone." Margaret stared at the screen, her mind racing with possibilities and dangers. Captain Morrison had clearly found a way to contact her without going through official channels. But what could he possibly want to show her that was worth the risk? She spent the night researching the address from the email. It led to an old building that had once housed government offices during World War II but had been converted to private apartments in the 1980s. The building's history was unremarkable according to public records, but Margaret's instincts told her there was more to discover. The next afternoon, Margaret stood outside the nondescript building in Bloomsbury, the brass key heavy in her coat pocket. The entrance was a simple wooden door between two ground-floor apartment windows, with no signs or markings to indicate its purpose. As she approached, the door opened before she could knock. Captain Morrison stood in the doorway, but he looked different out of uniform, older somehow and carrying the weight of whatever secret had brought them both to this moment. "Miss Williams," he said quietly, glancing up and down the street before stepping aside to let her enter. "Thank you for coming. I wasn't sure you would." The interior was dimly lit and sparsely furnished, with the feel of a space that was used occasionally but not lived in. Captain Morrison led her through a short hallway to a small room that had been converted into an office of sorts, with filing cabinets, a desk, and walls covered with newspaper clippings and photographs. "What is this place?" Margaret asked, looking around at what appeared to be some kind of research center. Captain Morrison moved to one of the filing cabinets and turned to face her. "This is where I've spent the last 28 years trying to make amends for my silence. Every document I've seen destroyed, every piece of evidence that's been buried, every story that's been silenced, I've tried to keep some record of it." Margaret's eyes widened as the implications of what he was saying sank in. "You've been keeping copies of destroyed documents?" "Not copies," Captain Morrison said grimly. "Originals. Documents that were supposed to be destroyed but somehow found their way here instead. Items that were removed from official collections before they could be catalogued. Evidence that certain people preferred the world never see." He gestured toward the filing cabinets, including documents from the Grosvenor wing that were removed before you arrived. Materials that Mrs. Blackwood didn't want you to find because they would have raised questions she couldn't answer. Margaret felt her knees grow, weak as the magnitude of what Captain Morrison was. Revealing hit her. He had been secretly preserving historical evidence for decades, maintaining an unauthorized archive of materials that powerful people wanted erased from history. "Why are you showing me this?" she asked, though part of her already knew the answer. Captain Morrison moved to the desk and picked up a thick manila folder. "Because I'm 73 years old, Miss Williams. And because 28 years of carrying these secrets alone has taught me that some truths are too important to die with the people who know them." Margaret stared at the manila folder in Captain Morrison's weathered hands, her mind struggling to process the magnitude of what he was revealing. The small room suddenly felt charged with the weight of decades of hidden history, and she could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. "Captain Morrison," she said carefully, "what you're showing me, this could destroy lives, careers, institutions." He nodded gravely, his fingers tightening on the folder. "Yes, it could. But Miss Williams, what about the lives that could have been saved if these truths had been known? What about the careers that were destroyed to protect these secrets? What about the institutions that failed in their duty to preserve history honestly?" Margaret moved closer to the filing cabinets, reading some of the newspaper clippings on the wall. Headlines about mysterious fires, unexplained gaps in historical records, researchers who had faced sudden career setbacks after asking inconvenient questions. The pattern was unmistakable once you knew to look for it. "How did you manage to save all this without anyone knowing?" she asked. Captain Morrison's smile was sad and tired. "Do you know what the most invisible person in the palace is, Miss Williams? A guard. We're trained to see everything and say nothing. We're present for every meeting, every crisis, every moment when difficult decisions are made. But we might as well be furniture for all the attention most people pay us." He opened the manila folder and spread its contents across the desk. Margaret's breath caught as she recognized several of the documents she had photographed in the Grosvenor wing. But there were dozens more she had never seen. "These are the documents that were removed before your assessment began," Captain Morrison explained. "Letters between Churchill and King George VI about postponing D-Day due to concerns about Soviet intentions. Correspondence between Queen Elizabeth and various prime ministers about keeping certain wartime activities classified indefinitely. Minutes from meetings where it was decided which historical events would be allowed into the public record and which would be buried." Margaret leaned over the desk, her trained eye quickly scanning the documents. The implications were staggering. If these materials were authentic, and every instinct she had told her they represented a systematic effort to control historical narrative at the highest levels of British government and monarchy. Captain Morrison, why now? After 28 years of silence, why are you choosing to share this with me? He moved to the window and peered through a gap in the curtains at the street below. Because I won't live forever, and because what happened to you this week has happened to dozens of other historians over the years. Researchers who got too close to inconvenient truths, who asked the right questions, who threatened to expose things that powerful people wanted to keep hidden. Margaret thought about Dr. Harrison's phone call, about Mrs. Blackwood's cold ultimatum, about the systematic removal of documents from the wing. How many historians have been silenced? More than you'd think. Some were bought off with prestigious positions that kept them busy with safe research. Others were discredited through whisper campaigns about their methodology or professional ethics. A few simply found their access to archives and resources mysteriously restricted until they gave up and moved on to other fields. The weight of what Captain Morrison was telling her settled over Margaret like a heavy blanket. She thought about her own career, her dreams of making meaningful contributions to historical understanding, and how close she had come to being another silenced voice. There's something else, Captain Morrison said, returning to the desk and pulling out a leather-bound journal from beneath the other documents. I've been keeping detailed records of every incident, every cover-up, every destroyed document. Names, dates, methods used to suppress information. It's all here. Margaret opened the journal and saw pages of meticulous handwriting documenting decades of historical suppression. The entries were organized chronologically, with cross-references and supporting evidence. It read like a detailed account of institutional conspiracy spanning multiple decades and involving some of the most powerful people in Britain. This is extraordinary, Margaret whispered, turning through pages that chronicled incident after incident of historical evidence being destroyed or hidden. But Captain Morrison, if you publish this information, you'll face serious consequences. They could prosecute you for theft, breach of confidence, violation of the Official Secrets Act. Captain Morrison's laugh was bitter. Miss Williams, I'm 73 years old with a pension that can't be taken away, and no family left to threaten. What exactly do you think they can do to me? That's worse than carrying this burden alone for 3 decades. Margaret looked up from the journal to study his face. Behind the weathered features and tired eyes, she saw something she hadn't recognized before. A man who had been preparing for this moment for years, who had calculated the risks and decided that truth was worth whatever consequences might follow. But why me? She asked. Why not take this to the press or to Parliament or to other historians with more experience and resources? Because you're young enough to have a long career ahead of you, talented enough to know what these documents really mean, and stubborn enough to refuse to sign papers that would silence you forever, Captain Morrison replied. And because you're not yet part of the system that has a vested interest in keeping these secrets buried. Margaret felt the full weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. Captain Morrison was offering her the opportunity to expose decades of historical suppression, but also placing her directly in the path of powerful forces that had successfully silenced others for years. What exactly are you asking me to do? She said finally. Captain Morrison closed the journal and looked directly into her eyes. I'm asking you to be the historian I wish I had been brave enough to contact 20 years ago. Someone who will ensure that these documents see the light of day, that these stories are told, that the patterns of suppression are exposed so they can't continue. Margaret walked around the small room, looking at the evidence of systematic historical manipulation that surrounded her. Every instinct she had as a scholar told her that this information was too important to remain hidden. But every survival instinct she had warned her about the dangers of challenging such powerful institutions. If I agree to help you, she said slowly, what protection do we have? These people have resources, connections, legal teams. They've successfully suppressed this information for decades. Captain Morrison smiled for the first time since she had arrived. Miss Williams, do you know what the most powerful weapon against institutional secrecy is? Margaret shook her head. Simultaneous disclosure, he said, moving to another filing cabinet and retrieving a thick stack of addressed envelopes. I've spent 5 years preparing copies of the most significant documents, along with detailed explanations of their historical importance. These envelopes are ready to be sent to major newspapers, academic journals, television news programs, and historians around the world. Margaret stared at the envelopes, understanding immediately what Captain Morrison was proposing. You want to release everything at once to so many sources that suppression becomes impossible. Exactly. No single institution can silence 20 different news organizations and 50 different historians simultaneously. The story becomes too big, too widespread, too documented to bury. Margaret picked up one of the envelopes, noting that it was addressed to a prominent investigative journalist she recognized from television. How can you be sure these people will take the risk of publishing this information? Because, Captain Morrison said, each envelope contains not just historical documents, but also evidence of the suppression efforts themselves, the attempts to silence researchers, the destroyed evidence, the systematic manipulation of historical records. The cover-up becomes part of the story, and that's what makes it impossible to ignore. Margaret felt her heart racing as she realized the scope of what Captain Morrison had planned. This wasn't just about releasing hidden documents. It was about exposing an entire system of historical manipulation that had operated in secret for decades. When? She asked. That depends on you, Captain Morrison replied. I can send these envelopes today if you're willing to serve as the primary academic source for verification and analysis. Your credentials as a professional historian, combined with your recent experience at the palace, make you the ideal person to authenticate these materials and explain their significance. Margaret looked around the room one more time, taking in the evidence of decades of buried truth. She thought about her conversation with Dr. Harrison, about Mrs. Blackwood's cold dismissal, about all the historians who had been silenced before her. She thought about the stories that deserved to be told and the lessons that could be learned from honest examination of the past. Captain Morrison, she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. What do you need me to do? Captain Morrison's weathered face broke into the first genuine smile Margaret had seen from him since they had met. Miss Williams, I need you to do what you do best. Be a historian. Verify these documents, provide academic context, and help the world understand why this information matters. Over the next 3 hours, Captain Morrison walked Margaret through his carefully organized archive. Each filing cabinet contained documents from different time periods, all meticulously catalogued with detailed notes about their provenance and historical significance. The scope was breathtaking, evidence of historical suppression spanning from the Victorian era through to the present day. The key you're holding, Captain Morrison explained as they worked, opens a safety deposit box where I've stored the most sensitive original documents. If anything happens to me or to this archive, you'll need those materials to prove authenticity. Margaret nodded, understanding that Captain Morrison was essentially making her the custodian of decades of hidden history. The responsibility was enormous, but so was the opportunity to correct historical narratives that had been deliberately manipulated. As the afternoon wore on, they developed their strategy. Captain Morrison would send the prepared envelopes to news organizations and historians worldwide, but he would give Margaret a 48-hour head start to prepare her own academic analysis and to ensure the materials would receive proper scholarly attention. The initial reaction will be skepticism, Captain Morrison warned. People will question the authenticity, challenge your credentials, and try to discredit the entire revelation. You need to be prepared for personal attacks and professional pressure. Margaret thought about the career she had built so carefully, the reputation she had established, the dreams she had harbored about making her mark in historical research. All of that would be at risk if she proceeded with Captain Morrison's plan. But as she looked at the evidence surrounding her, documents that could reshape understanding of British diplomatic history, letters that revealed the human side of royal decision-making during crucial moments, records that showed how political considerations had repeatedly triumphed over historical truth, she knew she couldn't walk away. Captain Morrison, she said finally, I understand the risks. But these documents represent voices from the past that deserve to be heard. Stories that could teach us valuable lessons about diplomacy, leadership, and the consequences of keeping secrets. I can't let them be buried again. Captain Morrison reached into his jacket and pulled out a set of keys. These open the various filing cabinets here. This place will become yours to manage. I'm too old to continue this work alone, and someone needs to ensure that any future discoveries of suppressed historical materials have a safe home. Margaret accepted the keys, feeling their weight as both a practical tool and a symbol of the enormous responsibility she was accepting. "What will you do after we release this information?" "I'll face whatever consequences come," Captain Morrison said simply. "But I'll face them knowing that I finally did the right thing, that I chose truth over institutional loyalty, transparency over secrecy." 2 days later, Margaret sat in her flat, surrounded by copies of the documents Captain Morrison had entrusted to her. She had spent sleepless hours verifying authenticity, cross-referencing historical events, and preparing a comprehensive academic analysis that would accompany the document release. Her phone had been ringing constantly since Captain Morrison had sent out his envelopes the previous evening. Journalists, historians, palace officials, and even Dr. Harrison from the British Museum had all tried to reach her. She had ignored them all, focusing instead on preparing the most thorough and unassailable analysis of her career. The knock on her door came at exactly 9 o'clock in the morning. Margaret looked through the peephole to see Mrs. Blackwood standing in the hallway, flanked by 2 men in expensive suits who were clearly legal representatives. Margaret opened the door but left the security chain in place. "Mrs. Blackwood, I wasn't expecting visitors. Miss Williams, we need to discuss your recent activities. I think you'll find it beneficial to hear what we have to say." Margaret considered the woman who had tried to silence her just days before. "I'm afraid I'm quite busy this morning, Mrs. Blackwood. Perhaps you could make an appointment through proper channels." Mrs. Blackwood's carefully composed expression cracked slightly. "Miss Williams, you are playing with forces you don't understand. The consequences of your actions will extend far beyond your own career." "I understand perfectly well," Margaret replied calmly. "I'm a historian who has discovered evidence of systematic suppression of historical materials. My professional and ethical obligations are quite clear." One of the men in suits stepped forward. "Miss Williams, we're prepared to offer you a substantial consulting position with one of London's most prestigious historical societies. A position that would allow you to pursue your research interests with generous funding and complete academic freedom." Margaret almost laughed at the transparency of the attempted bribe. "Gentlemen, Mrs. Blackwood, I believe you may have misunderstood something fundamental about historians. We're not interested in comfortable positions that keep us quiet. We're interested in truth." She closed the door firmly and returned to her computer, where she was putting the finishing touches on her analysis. In 12 hours, her academic paper would be published simultaneously in 3 major historical journals, while Captain Morrison's document revelations would hit newspapers and news programs around the world. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Captain Morrison. "The envelopes have been delivered. No turning back now. Are you ready?" Margaret looked around her flat at the documents that would soon shake the foundation of how British royal and diplomatic history was understood. She thought about the historians who had been silenced before her, about the stories that had been buried, about the lessons that could finally be learned from honest examination of the past. She typed her response. "Ready. Let's make history." The next morning, Margaret woke to a world transformed. Her phone showed dozens of missed calls and hundreds of text messages. Outside her window, she could see news vans lining the street. The story had exploded across international media faster than even Captain Morrison had anticipated. Headlines screamed about hidden royal. Documents revealed diplomatic secrets, and palace guard exposes decades of historical cover-ups. Television news programs were featuring panel discussions, with historians debating the implications of the revelations. But it was the phone call from Captain Morrison that meant the most to her. "Miss Williams," his voice came through clearly, despite the obvious emotion, "I wanted to thank you. For the first time in 28 years, I feel like I've truly served the crown by serving the truth." Margaret smiled as she watched through her window as reporters prepared for another day of coverage. "Captain Morrison, thank you for trusting me with this responsibility, for showing me that sometimes the most important thing a historian can do is refuse to let important stories stay buried." "What will you do now?" he asked. Margaret looked at the keys Captain Morrison had given her, thinking about the archive of suppressed historical materials that was now her responsibility to maintain and protect. She thought about the other historians who might face similar pressure in the future, about the stories that still waited to be discovered and told. "I'm going to continue being a historian," she said firmly, "but now I'll be one who knows that the most important battles aren't fought in libraries and archives. They're fought in the space between truth and power, between transparency and secrecy." As Margaret prepared to face the media storm waiting outside her door, she reflected on how much had changed since she first walked through the gates of Buckingham Palace just weeks before. She had entered as a young archivist hoping to catalog historical artifacts. She was emerging as a historian who had helped expose decades of systematic suppression of historical truth. The palace guard had indeed begged her to stop. Her response to choose truth over silence, transparency over secrecy, historical integrity over institutional protection would echo through the academic world for generations to come. Margaret Williams had learned that sometimes the most important discoveries aren't found in ancient documents or buried artifacts. Sometimes they're found in the courage to ask difficult questions, to challenge powerful institutions, and to insist that the truth, no matter how inconvenient, deserves to see the light of day.